Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Misty Wild. I'm the COO of Culturati. We are an organization that convenes C-suite leaders, scholars, investors, and other executives to share research and best practices around corporate culture and leadership so that our businesses can succeed, employees can thrive, and our communities can flourish. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you our moderator today, Ray Bernamoff. Ray is the co-founder and chief creative officer of Loop, a safe, science-backed self-awareness tool that turns feedback from colleagues and community into actionable data and insights. Ray has spent the last decade guiding Fortune 500s and fast-growing startups to build beloved brands from the inside out, prioritizing their culture as much as their customers. Passionate about helping organizations and individuals live their purpose, Ray co-founded Loop to empower employees to own their development journey and the Loop Lab to embed a design thinking approach to behavior change within organizations. Please join me in welcoming Ray.
Thank you so much, Misty. Welcome, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here. And it's so wonderful to be with a community of people who all get the power of culture and to share this virtual stage with women who have each dedicated themselves to using feedback as a key to unlocking high performance cultures across different organizations. And so we'll begin today with a quick round of introductions, and then we can get into our discussion. And we'll certainly be involving you, our audience, via polls and chat along the way. We'll also be sure to hold some time towards the end for a Q&A. So with that, I'd love to get into intros and ask each of our panelists to share two professional points that can help give our audience some context in terms of your participation. Why are you here today? And then I would also love to hear at the end of that a personal anecdote of your most memorable feedback experience. So why don't we begin today with my co-founder, Mara Gerstein.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ray. Thank you, Misty. Great to be with you, Culturati community. So my name is Mara Gerstein, CEO and co-founder of Loop, as Ray just mentioned. I spent almost 20 years working in a wide variety of organizational environments with wildly different feedback systems, all of them broken. Once I became a manager of large teams in a tech consultancy and advertising firm, I realized that broken systems actually created real harm and were in fact really counterproductive for particularly women and people of color and the teams and organizations that they were a part of. And so we've been working at Loop for the past few years to create a SaaS platform that totally reframes the way that feedback for development is exchanged in the workplace and sort of elevates it as the necessary tool for growth and development and behavior change at scale. So really thrilled and honored to be on a panel with people who I consider some of the most illustrative, innovative thinkers in this space. Most terrible piece of feedback, hands down, was when a boss told me that if I wanted to be successful in my role, I was going to have to change my personality.
I guess we'll get into today whether that qualifies as developmental feedback, and more to come on that soon. But first, let's turn to Brody for an introduction.
Thank you, Ray. Oh, the things managers say. We can have a whole long conversation about that. Greetings, everyone. My name is Brody Reardon. I am delighted to be here with this group and with all of you today. I love talking about feedback, and I love it when other people do too. I am an industrial organizational psychologist and also an executive coach. And I've spent about 20 years doing work and research related to the topic of feedback. I'm the author of Feedback Fundamentals and Evidence-Based Best Practices and using feedback in organizational consulting. And I just love to nerd out on the topic of feedback. It's one of those things that the more time I spend on it, the more I realize how much those nuances really matter. One of my many memorable feedback experiences occurred about 15 years ago when I was doing my dissertation research. And another industrial psychologist said about my dissertation research that I should be cut off at the knees. So not terribly constructive, but very memorable.
Thank you for sharing that, Brody. And Carol.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here with all of you today. I'm Carol Shen, and I'm the founder of Start Culture Shift. And I partner with leaders and teams to improve work culture. And there's two areas that are specifically that I'm very passionate about working with leaders on. It's improving communication skills and collaboration skills. And the reason why those are areas of my focus is that those are really fundamental skill sets that help people to connect more and to build relationships and to create a safe space where feedback is possible, especially in this hybrid work environment. I've had experience across various leadership roles, focusing on learning and development, culture and talent advisor, nonprofit board leadership, and my recent clients have crossed different sectors, including private markets, tech, energy, and philanthropy. And my most memorable feedback experience is something I still remember very vividly. And I remember sitting down for my annual performance review, as many of us have. And I got my review rating, and it was a low meets. And I was frustrated. I was angry. And the reason why I was angry was because it wasn't so much the rating itself. It was just, I was like, why didn't I know earlier? Why didn't my boss feel comfortable sharing this with me so that I could do something about it? And I think that, I had the greatest respect for her as my boss. She was a very kind person, a very smart person, but I'm not sure she was equipped with the skill set to give me the feedback that I needed to grow. And so that's definitely going to be a theme that we talk about today.
Thank you so much, Carol, for sharing it. And I'm sure many in our audience can relate to your experience and the others that we heard today. And I'd love to start by setting the scene for what we're seeing in today's workplaces. We know, and I think as part of the promotion for this conversation, we talked about the increasing amount of data coming out in our new hybrid work environment, especially that people are more disengaged and stressed than ever. And so many of us are experiencing that personally and firsthand. And so I'd love to hear about those trends and really unpack what might be underlying them. And Carol, I would love to hear your perspective to begin.
Yeah, absolutely. If we think about where we are in this moment in terms of current work environment, things have changed dramatically for all of us in the past few years, especially coming out of COVID. And the reality is the way we get work done now is very different than 5-10 years ago, where most of our work is hybrid, in some cases all remote. And that means a lot less in-person time. And while, I have benefited hugely from flexible work arrangements. I'm sure many of you on this call have. There's so many benefits of that. But we've also seen is with this idea of doing work asynchronously, in hybrid situations, remote situations, people are feeling less connected at work. Engagement is decreasing. Ray, I'm going to actually have you pull up a slide that shows some stats and research out there. The headlines, unfortunately, aren't looking great. They're not that positive. Daily loneliness is something that is cited that is increasing. And as you'll see here, what happens with all of these factors and contributes to a disengaged work culture. And we all, I think, have experienced probably work cultures where engagement is low, and that has a lot of consequences, right? It's an environment where there's increased frequency of complaining and blaming, greater emphasis on an individual versus team performance. So there's, I think, a certain urgency right now for us to focus on solutions that help get us to improving work culture. And the great news is feedback is one of those solutions. Looking at the next page, the research has shown that regular, meaningful feedback delivered well does improve employee engagement. And continuous feedback is something that organizations really need. I think the challenge is a lot of organizations don't necessarily know how to start, or what are the things that need to be true for this to happen. The good news is we're here to talk about that with all of you. And the goal is, feedback it enables an engaged work culture, right? This is something that we all have control of and that we can all work towards. And imagine working in a work culture where there's open and honest communication, continuous learning and growth, collaboration, and accountability. I think that's the direction that a lot of organizations, leaders, teams are wanting to go, but aren't sure how.
And
Ray, I'll
before
hand it back to you.
Before we move on, I guess from this point, the only thing that I would add, agreeing wholeheartedly, of course, with everything Carol just said, I don't think we're going to have a lot of like really intense debates with people disagreeing on this panel, but is just to point out, I think the last statistic that is on that first slide, right? I think a lot of times we think about engagement as like something that could be like woo woo or nice to have, but there is really a price tag, a very huge price tag that is associated with not paying attention to the issues with workplace culture that we are facing in a private world, a hybrid world. So, low employee engagement, resulting in almost $9 trillion of lost, GDP. So just wanted to put a fine point on that. So we really know why we're here.
Thank you, Mara, and thank you, Carol. And drilling into that even further, we know we're here to talk about feedback and specifically feedback for development. And so I'd love to turn to Brody, who is our resident feedback expert, the author of Feedback Fundamentals, and hear from you how you define feedback and specifically the role that you see feedback for development playing within a larger organizational ecosystem.
Yeah, you got it, Ray. I would be delighted. I take a pretty purist perspective on feedback. Feedback is really data on your actions or behaviors or lack thereof relative to some kind of expectation, goal, or criterion, right? Feedback has come to be used in a lot of different ways and has a lot of different connotations for people, but in its purest form, it's really holding up a mirror and sharing reflections on what we observed or heard or noticed about your behavior relative to what we were expecting to see. Now, I want to make the distinction between feedback for evaluation and feedback for development, since that's a core focus of why we're here. And Ray, I think we actually have a slide that kind of summarizes this too. If you can pull up page 4, that would be lovely. So feedback for evaluation is really meant to let you know how you have done at the end of something, so such as a project or performance cycle. It is evaluating your performance against some set of expectations or criteria. Now, one of the things that can feel really hard about feedback for evaluation is that it can also feel like it's too late to do something about it. Like, this is it. This is the evaluation and the judgment, case closed, too late. Now, contrast that with feedback intended for development, which is given with the intention of helping someone learn, become more self-aware, or receive information and data that will help them course correct on something that they are working on. So in feedback research, we often refer to these two types of feedback as outcome feedback and process feedback. It's essentially talking about the same things, but sometimes in academic research, we like to have very special terminology for things. Now, both types of feedback elicit different emotional and cognitive responses from the person who is receiving the feedback. And people are generally more open to process feedback or developmental feedback because they feel like they have an opportunity to apply it and actually do something with it. It's helpful because it tells them what they need to do to have higher performance or get closer to achieving their goals. So in some research that I did a really long time ago with Megan Van Hoy and Paul Levy, we found that people are specifically really receptive to negative process feedback. So in other words, developmental feedback that tells you you have a gap or something that you need to work on, but they tend to prefer positive outcome feedback or receive a positive evaluation. So this is a really important distinction. If you give people feedback along the way and it's something that they can act on and they don't feel like it's a judgment, they're much more likely to be open to negative feedback. But if you're giving them the final assessment of how they've done about something, that negative feedback is less likely to be received well, and people much prefer positive feedback and no surprises.
That really, really resonates. And I see we have in the chat already a dialogue going around whether there are sort of structured feedback processes in place within our audience's organizations. And I would love to hear from the audience around whether they feel like their feedback in their organization is more evaluative or more developmental. If you can drop that in the chat, we'll take sort of another quick pulse check on how people are currently experiencing these different types of feedback in their day-to-day. And so far we have evaluative coming in, which definitely makes sense because very often traditional performance management systems are focused on evaluative feedback. Thank you for sharing that.
I just wanted to share with this slide. I personally found it really helpful, and I've seen it many times already, but it reminds me of why when I was in that moment getting the surprise evaluation, it explains the frustration, right? Felt like a judgment. It felt like it was too late for me to change anything. And I think most of us want an opportunity to demonstrate certain changes or shifts and things for a better outcome. Anyways, I find this slide very, very helpful and reminding me the difference between evaluative and developmental feedback.
Carol, that's what I love to refer to as the feedback conundrum. You know, one of the primary reasons we give people feedback is so that they can do something with it, right?
Yes.
Because we want to see different behavior, more of something, less of something in the future. But when we're giving people evaluative feedback, they don't always have that opportunity for redemption.
Right.
And so you're a lot less likely to be open to it because it's kind of like, well, it's too late now.
Mm-hmm.
I think, just building on that, one of the things I found most interesting sort of operating in this world lately is that, people are, and I'm sure in the Culturati community, they are very familiar, right, with the relationship between healthy feedback cultures and business results. If we want to pull up, I think, slide 5, we have a couple statistics that talk about that, but, there are so many more. And I think the other sort of point of frustration, right, is that we want good feedback cultures. They are our aspiration. I see a lot of comments in the chat around developmental feedback being an aspiration, when fundamentally most organizations are using performance management systems for their feedback processes and expecting that to drive business results. When in fact, if you want to have a healthy feedback culture, it actually has to be developmental feedback. And we don't have, in many cases, the tools and systems and processes to really affect change in that area. So Ray, if you want to skip from that slide to, where is it? Slide 8. I know we're bouncing around a little bit. I think one of our, fundamental findings and premise, doing this work is that you can't use performance management for both feedback for evaluation and feedback for development. It really breaks. And there's a ton of data on slide 8, if we want to move there, that sort of speaks to that point as well. But you all get it.
Absolutely. Thank you for really painting the picture of that distinction and for everyone chiming in around the experiences they've had, where they have been, where they are, and ultimately where they want to go. And hopefully today's conversation can help lead you there. So as we start to think about reframing feedback, right, and beginning to kind of fix the dichotomy, repair that dichotomy between feedback for evaluation and feedback for development, I'd love to hear a little bit about how to approach that reframing. Perhaps, Brody, we can start with you.
Oh, I would love to talk about that. I think the most important place to start is with understanding the kinds of experiences people have had throughout their lives. And Ray, if you want to click back to slide 7, we kind of illustrate this. Most people have a pretty negative connotation of feedback. You say the word feedback and it almost immediately elicits an anxious response from people. And that's because for most of us, we've lived our entire lives receiving feedback from people who are pretty unskilled at giving feedback. And so that shapes the expectations and the emotional reactions that we have when it comes to talking about the big F word, feedback. So I think for organizations that want to start to shift the tone of feedback, this is where you have to start. You have to remember where people are coming in and where their heads are. Certainly, you will always have people who are outliers and love talking about feedback like some of us do, but the vast majority of people probably have not had great experiences throughout their lives. The next thing that I think is really helpful is to start reframing what feedback means within organizations. And I love the headline on the slide that feedback has a PR challenge. Really starting to help people understand and think about feedback as data, not a judgment or an evaluation. One exercise that I've done, and I write about this in my book, and I've done it with some clients, is challenge people to actually pick one day and notice all of the feedback experiences that they have. How many times you received feedback, gave feedback, used feedback. And most people are very surprised to find that most of that feedback is not a big deal. We tend to over index on the big deal feedback moments when we think about it. But the reality is, you will probably have some kind of feedback experience 25 times today and not even notice because it didn't feel painful or evoke a strong negative emotional reaction from you. So for organizations to start reframing for people what feedback means, and it's not the big F feedback, it's really useful data that helps us orient ourselves in time and space and assess the progress that we're making on any goal or project or something that's important to us. Ray, I think we also have a slide about reframing feedback as data, if you want to jump ahead to slide 9.
Mhm.
Awesome, thank you, yes. So, feedback, like one of the origin stories of feedback, especially in the industrial psychology world, is how critical it is for assessing goal progress. It's very difficult to know how you're doing when it comes to making progress on any goal that you have if you're not receiving feedback. And so, really helping people understand that if you lack feedback, you are sort of in a vacuum in terms of knowing how you're doing relative to expectations or anything that you're trying to accomplish or that's important to you. So a little bit of a PR shift. And then, of course, upskilling is always so important. I think it's really easy in organizations to assume that people just know how to give feedback or ask for feedback or what to do with it once they receive it. But in my experience, most people really haven't received helpful guidance on this. So investing a little bit of time in really helping people understand what makes for high quality developmental feedback, focusing on observable behaviors, being as specific as possible, not confusing advice for feedback. Feedback is really, the best feedback is when it's dry and simply sounds like you are holding up the mirror and describing what someone did or did not do. Not when you're telling them what they should have done or what's wrong with it or what they were thinking, because as much as you think you know, you don't actually know. So really helping people figure out how to deliver feedback in a way that's not inflammatory. And then also focusing on the other side of the equation and helping people develop some skills around proactively asking for feedback, knowing what to do with feedback when they receive it. You don't just have to take it at face value. You can ask curious questions to make sure you really understand what it is the other person's trying to tell you. If someone gives you feedback that is a vague generalization about your behavior, or in Mara's case, about your personality, one of the most mature things that you can do is say, can you give me some specific examples so I know what this really looks like on a day-to-day basis? And that's going to give you more useful information. I'm going to stop there because you can probably guess that I could talk about this for the rest of our time together, and there are other things that we want to hear about.
And it is a very serious PR problem, and I love all the applicable tactical suggestions that you've shared. Carol, Mara, anything to add?
I mean, I would just say that, one of the things Brody talked about, right, that feedback is really the way for us to know how we're doing, how things are going. It makes continuous feedback really, really important. And it is particularly vital, I think, in the work world that we find ourselves in, both because we're trying to build trusted, connected relationships when we're not always in the same office, but also because we are operating in a, technical, political, social, environmental world that is just changing at a dizzyingly rapid pace. And the only way for teams to remain effective and nimble in that environment is to iterate and to try things, to think out of the box, to be able to take risks. There's a lot that goes into that, and we can talk, more about it as we go on. growth mindset, psychological safety, there's a lot there, but all of those things become possible only if there are feedback mechanisms in place, so that when you're going to try something, that you're not just going to try it and sink or swim, but that there are people who are around you that are going to give you feedback and help you understand in a safe way how those, risks and experiments have turned out. So I just don't think there's ever been a time when feedback and candid and healthy feedback has ever been more urgent.
Yeah, and I wanted to add an additional lens of reframe, and then also after that transition to Loop, because I'm sure many of you are very curious about Loop and how it fundamentally helps encourage those feedback loops within an organization. Rick, I was going to have you bring up slide 11, because another perspective that has the more I work with clients, the more I speak to leaders and teams, the more I realize there is a lens of feedback that is often missed, which is if we're trying to connect the dots between shifting culture so it's more open to feedback and where to start. A lot of times it's natural for us humans in general to talk about what other things other people can do. And the best place, a great place to start, is starting with you, right? When you make yourself available, especially as a leader of a team, to be open to feedback, to demonstrating, asking for feedback, it enables your growth and increased self-awareness. But that role modeling, I think of it as a pebble in the pond, right? The act of you demonstrating a psychological safety to ask for feedback and to be open to it has ripple effects with your ability to impact your team's growth, their ability to connect with you, and over time, a shift in that culture where there's more open and honest communication and where feedback just becomes normal, whether it's on a project, a process, whether it's changing or suggesting behavioral shifts. It can happen. And I think that a lens to consider is definitely looking at yourself and thinking about what you can do as a leader on a team to start role modeling that behavior. I also have seen what Loop does for organizations and kind of lowering the barriers and preventing things that are getting in the way of feedback, and would love for both Mara and Ray potentially to start talking about what Loop does to kind of connect the dots of how do we make feedback easier, more effective? What are the kind of questions that you can ask to really open up that two-way communication between a leader and their teams and within an organization?
Thanks, Carol. I think, where I would like to go if possible, I see some specific questions in the chat around kind of what is developmental feedback? How do you actually, create and deliver developmental feedback? What makes it different than feedback for evaluation? And I think we actually have a slide that it might be useful to just talk a little bit about. What do you want to do if you want to reframe feedback as data for self-growth? And certainly, as Carol was saying, some of it has to really be about the leadership, right? Understanding and a commitment to why developmental feedback is important. And that means staff commitment, resources commitment, the commitment to the change management that goes along with introducing, new norms and processes. In terms of then how you actually reframe the data itself, there are a couple of points that we wanted to talk about. And, these are, built into the platform that we've created, that we worked with Brody and several other advisors just based on the latest feedback research that is out there. But I think that the principles here are really the thing I'd like to focus on, which is that if you want feedback to be for development, it has to be disaggregated from evaluation, right? So we said it can't be part of a performance management system. It can't be used for assessments. It can't be used for making decisions about who is getting a raise or who's getting a promotion, because then the feedback becomes, as we like to say, part of the political theater of reviews and performance management. And that is not what we want, right? We want it to be candid information that is real and authentic and motivating to the person who's receiving it. In order for that to happen, in order for that good feedback to get into the system, the individual who's seeking feedback has to be empowered to ask for the feedback. Now, they may need guidelines or a tool or processes, but fundamentally they're in control, right? They get to decide what questions they ask, what they're seeking feedback on, when, and from whom. There needs to be training. It could be one-on-one, it could be in a group, it could be AI delivered, but around growth mindset, and also skills, right, for how to actually, give unbiased evidence-based feedback. I think one of the biggest issues is just lack of skill, right, when it comes to asking for and giving and receiving feedback. The feedback, and this is one of the most controversial elements here, needs to be private between the person who's seeking feedback and the people who are giving it. Like, let's really be sure this is not political theater, right? Let's be sure that the person who is giving the feedback is not giving it because they're trying to help get a friend promoted or to punish someone, who, pissed them off at the water cooler. Make it private. There has to be a framework for both big picture feedback. How am I showing up in the world? How do people see me as a leader? And feedback, as we like to say, in the motion of work. So how did that Zoom call go? How did I handle a recent conversation? It really can't be one or the other. And the tools have to really be integrated to allow for something which can be a sort of virtuous cycle. And then really importantly, and I think we may get into this a little bit later, there's so much opportunity to use AI and natural language processing to present feedback data in an entirely new and much more actionable way. So I hope that this has answered some of the questions that are in the chat, and we can talk more about it certainly as we continue on.
Mara, it might be a good time to bring up slide 14. At least it's always helpful for me to see examples.
Oh, sure.
The types of questions that, we've talked about the importance of feedback, and developmental feedback is the place to focus on. And there's a certain reality that, I've certainly worked with clients where there's good intentions, right? And so we do some skill building, we get the team on board with asking colleagues for feedback, but the how matters too. Just saying, hey, do you have any feedback for me? It's not specific enough. And one thing I love about how Loop is designed is the types of questions that are in Loop to help teams and individuals ask each other for feedback are really specific. If you look at the slide, these are just a few examples. There's a lot more questions, but there's the topics for growth, self-awareness, understanding impact, deliverables, projects, ideas, communication, working with others. If you look specifically at the questions, they are framed in such a way that it is much more developmental and less judgmental and less evaluative. And I think that's a key to success, to using a tool like Loop, embedding it kind of into the day-to-day communication between folks when it comes to feedback.
Yeah. And part of the reason why these questions look so different than, typical questions that we associate with feedback tools, performance management tools, is that they are very open-ended, right? They are going in most cases to solicit qualitative free-form feedback. Even the 1 to 10 questions, as you'll see in understanding impact, there's a number there, but you'll see the follow-up question, how can I get to a 10? So that's all free-form. You don't normally see that, right? Because when you're dealing with lots and lots of data, the tendency is to, rely on quantitative measures. It's much easier to kind of compare people against each other, 1 to 5, to map them to particular competencies. Whereas here, this actually gives, the people who are responding a really directed but free-form way to say what is on their mind, right? They don't have to necessarily just help people understand how they're mapped to a competency. So I think rest of the panel, tell me if we want to kind of get into the role of AI in all of this, or cover off on any other topics before we go there.
I think it would be great to talk about how that's playing out in the workplace, right? We've established that there's the need, that people are experiencing burnout, that there's a mass experience of loneliness and isolation. We recognize that our existing systems are not delivering developmental feedback. And so as is like the dialogue at large about how AI influences today's workplace. I'd love to hear from each of you about the opportunities for integrating AI into some of the processes that we're starting to talk about. Perhaps, Mara, do you want to begin?
Yeah, I can kick us off. I mean, I think, when you think about as I was starting to say, the biggest barriers to people getting high quality feedback, it is often that people don't know how to ask. So let's give them the right questions. Let's put them into a tool and a process that helps them figure that out. It's often that the feedback is not personalized, right? So it's a bunch of numbers mapped to competencies. They don't necessarily see themselves in the feedback. And then you also have the fact that it's often, if it is qualitative, it's very raw. And so it becomes, very hard to parse. I'm sure everyone's had the experience of like going through reviews where there's a bunch of raw text and you're trying to figure out who said what and decide what the themes are and eventually kind of throwing the report in a drawer. The good news is that almost all of those challenges are things that AI can actually do really, really well. And in many cases, better than humans would have been able to, even if they had the time to do it. So, some examples here, right? AI can do a great job at looking for patterns in qualitative feedback data. And so one of the things that we do on our platform is we take these open-ended questions in response to, high quality prompts, and we look for the patterns using a model that utilizes generative AI. We look for patterns so that we're able to present reports back to feedback seekers that say, here's what 3 or more people are saying about you. Here's what 2 people are saying about you. And they're 100% personalized feedback themes. So it makes it really easy for people to be able to see the signal in the noise, see how many people are saying what, to have a deeper understanding of who they are and also what behavior change they want to prioritize. You can also use AI to help train people, right? So we've talked about a bunch of the kind of mindset shifts that need to happen in order to be able to have a healthy feedback culture. Growth mindset, psychological safety, less bias, good feedback skills. These are all trainings that can happen either one-on-one or in groups using AI. And AI can even do a good job at giving you feedback on your feedback to understand, are you kind of expressing bias, and could you come up with some better examples? So I guess those are a few of the ways that AI, I think, has a really exciting role to play in the work that, we all want to do. And I'm sure Brody and Carol have some other ideas as well.
Mara, I'm just thinking about your manager who told you the feedback that you need to change your personality. And wouldn't it have been wonderful for that person to have AI that would have said, it looks like you're giving feedback based on someone's personality. What are some specific observable behaviors that you have seen?
Yes, would have been nice. Hopefully he couldn't come up with any.
Well, there you go. When you really stop and reflect, oh, interesting. Maybe this is just my own pet peeves and bias shining through.
Thank you for bringing it back, Brody. I'm wondering, Carol, how you've seen AI play a part in this organizational change that we're talking about.
Yeah, my perspective, especially as I work with clients who are interested in products like Loop, it just really makes this process of a team being open to feedback and shifting to feedback culture, lower cost, faster, more efficient, right? Sometimes the barriers to, if you've got a leader who is already on board, let's say the leader has bought into the fact that feedback matters and it's critical to the productivity of a team and the engagement of a team, great. How do I start? What AI has enabled is not having to take on, hire a bunch of consultants and something that's very expensive and takes a long time. I mean, literally, with the technology behind something like Loop, you can get started right away. The onboarding process to a tool like this is very fast. And then there's a certain efficiency where it doesn't take months to get customized reports. What Mara and Ray have demoed to me is that, from the moment that you decide, X number of people on the team want to get started on this, use the tool, to the moment that you actually get the live, very high quality data, it's just a couple weeks. It's fast. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I see we have a lot of really awesome questions coming in through the chat, and we'll turn to those in just a moment. But before we conclude the panel part of today's session, I would love to just hear a little bit about how to really take the first steps, right? To talk a little bit more about, once hopefully we've elevated the inspiration for pursuing and really trying to instill a developmental feedback culture in the many organizations that are represented here. And so how can our audience get started? What are the kinds of steps that they need to take to really move towards a more developmental feedback culture? Brody, would you like to begin?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier about, choosing to reframe feedback as data, not as an evaluation or a judgment, investing in some upskilling so that people know what it means and what it looks like to really be giving high quality, specific developmental feedback. I think something else, one part of the equation that we haven't really talked about yet is how to do something with feedback, because the whole idea here behind developmental feedback is that you are integrating it into your workflow and using it as a tool and data and information and insight to help you get better or improve the way you're doing things. Right. I think we have a pretty cool model of how this process can work at an individual level. If you pull up slide 12. Great, thank you. Yeah, so the process of receiving and accepting feedback can feel a little daunting. We are all hardwired to have a fast emotional reaction when we receive feedback. Sometimes even when we receive glowing positive feedback, you still have a really strong emotional reaction that can get in the way of you thinking really thoroughly about it. And so one of the things that can be really helpful is to take the pressure off and focus on ways to experiment. Behavior change isn't easy. Figuring out how to act on and implement feedback can feel a little intimidating. And so I really encourage people to take what I call a dip a toe approach. Dip a toe into trying something with this, right? Okay, so someone gave me feedback that I was really hard to hear, that I tend to interrupt people during meetings and they feel like I don't listen. Okay, well, I go through my whole psychological process of reacting to this and having self-doubt and feeling judged, but then I'm like, well, let me figure out one step forward to learn a little bit more about this. So dipping a toe in this instance might be selecting a meeting to really pay attention and notice my own behavior. Catch myself in the act of wanting to jump in and interrupt someone and then pausing and holding back. So sometimes collecting some additional data on yourself is an important first step. And then figuring out what are one or two things that you can do to take baby steps forward to start to act on the feedback that you've received. So for organizations that want to really focus on developmental feedback, it's the front half of the equation. Upskilling and educating people on how to give, ask for, and receive feedback effectively. But then it's also giving them the support and guidance and infrastructure that they need on the back end to figure out then what. How do I turn feedback into action and do it in a way that feels not intimidating, and I'll be less likely to procrastinate about it.
And I want to just jump in and make one more point about that, which is what we have found, when we go into organizations and introduce Loop and sort of new ways of working, is that one of the kind of biggest mind blow moments is when an accountability structure is set up around feedback in community. So, traditionally, accountability is really about an employee and their manager. We haven't talked a lot about managers, but so a whole other topic, the reasons why we have the highest levels of manager, burnout, ever. I think in part it's because they're spending 5 weeks out of every year administering performance management systems that, everybody hates, but more on that later. Instead of it being solely in the hands of the manager to guide people, through this process. And certainly some managers are capable of that and can be helpful. I think training managers to have a coaching mindset is really helpful when you have a developmental process for feedback. But the other thing, and where I began was, how can we create the forums and the systems, the norms around people actually sharing their feedback with the other people that they work with, right? If you're receiving feedback from your colleagues and your community, share with them what you learned. Share with them what your commitments to behavior change are. Ask them to hold you accountable over time. And what happens there, of course, is as if many people are doing that, all of a sudden you have behavior change at scale, a very high growth culture, a culture with tremendous amounts of, trust and connection, transparency and purpose. To us, I mean, that is really the new world of work.
Mm-hmm. And to build on that, Mara, I think of feedback as a way for leaders, employees, individuals to take the time and effort, especially if you think about, feedback isn't the easiest thing. It's not intuitive for us to give. But when we are set up for success, right? If we've got a team environment where it's like, hey, we're ready to embrace feedback, we need a little bit of help with the upskilling on the training and something like Loop for the infrastructure to be there to support that in an ongoing way. What you're saying to the team in that environment is that, personally for me, I care about that quality of my work, the output of my work. I care about you as a colleague. And that's what feedback is conveying. I think that's what we're trying to reframe feedback as. The reason why feedback is a secret weapon for connection is because the intention behind it is to help others grow, help others. And when people feel that, they start to feel the connections. You don't feel so isolated. You don't feel like you're disengaged. You feel like you're within a team, hopefully a community and organization where there's support for each other's growth. And I wanted to leave with that, because that for me has been life-changing when I think about feedback in my role, the role of clients, the role with colleagues. It really is a powerful tool.
I feel like we're ending up at like exactly the title. Nicely done. We're ending up at exactly the title of the panel, right? Which is really that this type of feedback, developmental feedback, is the secret ingredient, right? The secret sauce that people don't totally know exists to really creating, high growth, high productive cultures in a hybrid world. So maybe it's a good time to take some questions.
I think it's a great time to take questions. And I love that ending note, Carol, around how we're really, we're talking about a big shift here. There's the reframing at the organizational level, there's the reframing at the individual level, and there's the reframing across relationships. And we've talked about kind of what that movement looks like. And we've also shared some very actionable tactics. So I'm so excited to see the ripple effects of this conversation out in the world, and would love to address some of the questions and concerns that are bubbling up from our audience that is with us live. One that's emerging is around privacy. And I know Mara touched on, very particularly with Loop, the kind of fundamental philosophy of ensuring that the feedback that's exchanged between the person seeking it and the person providing it really remains within, that relationship and is not kind of visible. But we had a few people asking about kind of, is there a scenario in which developmental feedback goes beyond that one-on-one, in which it's shared with HR or with managers?
Misty, did you want us to take these in order, or can we go slightly out of order on the questions?
Whatever you would like.
Okay. Great.
Ray, I have a strong perspective on the question you just posed about privacy, if that's all right. I sometimes think about receiving feedback as being in your bathing suit. And you don't always want to be in your bathing suit in front of anyone and everyone, right? When you receive really honest, candid feedback, it can feel very vulnerable. And this might hear some resistance from the audience if it doesn't feel totally realistic. I think it's really important that whoever is receiving feedback owns that feedback. And there can be an expectation for them to have a follow-up conversation with their manager about what they learned or what they took away from the feedback. But I think it's really important that they own the feedback that they receive. They choose what they do with it. They choose who they share it with and how they want to share it. I often work with executive coaching clients on their 360s, and it's very important to me that their manager doesn't get a copy of their 360. We will have a conversation with their manager where we talk about what they learned and took away from the experience. But that is like standing in front of your manager in your bathing suit, in my opinion. And so I think it's really important to give people the trust and the empowerment and the ownership to receive that feedback for themselves and then choose what they do with it.
Thank you. Other thoughts on privacy play?
Yeah, I mean, agree wholeheartedly with what Brody said. I think one of the things that we've tried to do with Loop, which, you know, is primarily, right, a tool for private exchange of feedback, is to just create really easy sharing functionality, and then to put some sort of rules and norms in place about, you know, when does an employee share feedback with a manager? When might an employee share feedback with a team? When might an employee share, or a leader actually share feedback with their team about what they're doing with their feedback? So, because I think, yes, privacy is essential, and the sharing piece is actually also essential. And so there have to be mechanisms for doing that as well, for accountability, for relationships. You know, people often feel like feedback is given but not actioned, which I think is really demotivating on both sides. So I think you got to kind of close that loop as well.
And we have a question around the difference between coaching and developmental feedback. Who would like to address that?
I feel like that's a kind of a good one for Brody too. I mean, I'm happy to take it, but right in
I
your
feel like
there.
I just can't wait to jump in here and talk about these things. I love this question. You know, one of my favorite quotes ever from an article about coaching and feedback that's probably 20 years old at this point referred to coaching and feedback as natural bedfellows. And the reason I like that framing is because they go so beautifully together and they are different things. So one way I like to think about it is, you know, you've got a whole range of different ways that you can communicate and engage with people, ranging from directive to non-directive. On the directive side, it's telling, advising, directing. As you move closer, it's more like mentoring, guiding, giving feedback. On the opposite end of that spectrum is coaching. And again, I take a pretty purist lens on coaching. Coaching is all about being non-directive. It's listening to people at a level they've never been listened to before. It's using powerful questions to help draw other people out and assume that the answers are within them. So feedback, developmental feedback, is very different because you are holding up the mirror. You are sharing something with someone as opposed to pulling something out of them. And feedback and coaching work so beautifully in concert. You know, one way to approach a feedback conversation is to weave a coaching approach into it. You share feedback with someone and you say, how is this landing with you? What else would be helpful to know? If you could do something about this and wave your magic wand, what would you do? Next time that you have an opportunity to work on this, what do you want to try? Those are all examples of coaching questions, very different from feedback, which is holding up the mirror and sharing the data. So they're very different things and they work beautifully together.
Fantastic. Thank you for that very clear illustration.
I'm very handsy.
There's a great question here that I would love to hear Carol's perspective on in regards to an audience member that has a few clients who really want to implement 360s on their teams. And they're wondering, what are the things you think about setting teams up for success and not just checking the box, but actually creating 360s as a tool for amplifying learning culture?
I might have Mara and Brody join in on this one as well. In terms of, you know, I usually take at least my approach. So if I'm working with a client and they're in that boat, usually I take a step back and just make sure that there's a clear understanding on why this is being done, right? Is this because a lot of times 360s are associated more with evaluative feedback versus developmental. And I'd want to make sure that the first question is understanding where are folks coming from? Because what I have found in my experience, even though I have very strong opinions on the importance of developmental feedback and its role and growth, not everyone is there. And so kind of taking a step back, starting there, seeing where those folks at, and depending on where that team is, then move forward in what is, you know, meaningful, but steps that are realistic. And it might be, okay, let's start with, I'm not going to give this group the benefit of the doubt. Let's say they're more in the evaluative mindset, then might start with a little bit of just education, coaching, training on growth mindset and the importance of creating environments where there's an opportunity for growth. and then going from there. Mara, Brody, I'm going to add that because I know so many companies want 360s. I've been a part of 360s. It is, mixed bag of results in terms of how helpful that is. So would love to hear, realistically options that people have if they're looking at 360 and kind of an approach that they should consider.
I mean, I don't want to turn this into like a sales pitch for Loop. We created the platform really just, as we said, at the high level, creating a forum for the exchange of developmental feedback. We sort of accidentally created a very innovative version of a 360. And so, we do the growth mindset training. We do train people about how to give great feedback. We do ask open-ended questions that people can really send out to, colleagues and community to kind of get that well-rounded piece. And then, we use an AI model to transform all of that qualitative feedback data into, areas of strength and, areas for development that are very concrete and very actionable. Whether it's Loop or another tool, I think that the elements of that are, what is really important when thinking about how to create a 360, which is for somebody and also gives them the information that they need. And then really importantly, when you're using something like that, it really does become a relationship and culture tool, right? Because you are opening up lines of communication that never existed before. You're choosing the people that you want to give you feedback. You're asking them very heartfelt questions. In many cases, they're feeling like for the first time, it could be their leader or a colleague really wants to know what they think, and that they're not going to be out on their own answering the question, right? That we're going to look for patterns, right, across the responses. So it's a really productive model, I think, for people to get well-rounded feedback.
And I know we're approaching the hour. Certainly, if anyone has to jump off, we understand. There's one last question from Kate I'd love to surface as we wrap up, because I think it's a question we hear a lot when we're having conversations with organizations. They say that they're intrigued by the suggestion to disaggregate feedback from evaluation, but it strikes them as a really disruptive idea. And they're curious about how it's been received by organizations that Loop works with. For them, it spurs the question that if performance reviews don't include evaluative feedback, what's left?
We're out of time. That's a very juicy question, and so much to talk about there. This kind of process, very quickly, as I know people are jumping off, this type of process isn't going to replace performance management, but it is a way for people to get developmental feedback that is going to completely change the culture in context in which people are doing performance management. So, plenty more to say, but just I would get that kind of quick explanation in there as we wrap. What do you want? What's on your mind, Brody?
Yeah. Well, I just want to chime in on that too. I don't think that we're suggesting that there's not a place for evaluative feedback.
Totally.
We're just saying if you really want to help people and help people grow, put more emphasis on the developmental feedback. I've worked with some organizations that have adopted a philosophy of no surprises during any formal feedback or review process. So the developmental feedback all throughout the year can roll up to the evaluative feedback that's shared at the end of the year. The key is just understanding that these serve different purposes and they're going to land differently with people. And no one should hear anything ever for the first time in a formal review conversation.
I love that as a final note. I am so grateful for each of your perspectives and for all the audience members that have joined us today or might be watching in the future. Thank you so much.